presentation lectures. We've had 3 evening lectures presented by Andrew Berlin, who's been a professor in residence this semester at the Berg Graduate Center, and 3 responses. So trailers for the responses delivered the night before, and then the full-scale presentations here in this room at lunchtime, just a scant however many hours, 15 or 16, after the lecture, to which they are responses, but responses really construed and presented in the terms of and through the minds of individual scholars, each of whom, in their own right, represents a fascinating cosmos of questions. The final presenter here with us this afternoon is Azzan Yadin-Israel, who is currently at Rutgers University, a full professor in the Department of Jewish Studies and Classics. He's previously taught at the University of Chicago Divinity School and at Princeton University. His BA in Philosophy and Jewish Thought is from the Hebrew University, and his PhD in Jewish Studies from the University of California at Berkeley. He's the author of a series of books. First, Scripture as Logos, Rabbi Ishmael and the Origins of Midrash, 2004, University of Pennsylvania Press. Scripture and Tradition, Rabbi Akiva and the Triumph of Midrash, also University of Pennsylvania Press, 2014. And most recently, The Grace of God and the Grace of Man, Theologies of Bruce Springsteen, published by Linguistics Press in 2016. It's a serious book. I heard about it last night at dinner. If you want to test your knowledge of Catholic theology, I would not test it against him. Nor indeed your knowledge of Bruce Springsteen lyrics. Some of the articles that he's published, just to give you a sense of range: Authorial Intent, Human and Divine, forthcoming in the Festschrift for Danny Boyarin. For Mark was Peter's Tana, Oral Tradition versus Eyewitness History in Papias, published in 2015 in the Journal of Early Christian Studies. Kabbalah, Deuterosis, sounds like a disease, I'm sorry. Kabbalah, Deuterosis, and Semantic Incommensurability, a preliminary study, and the Festschrift for Peter Scheffer, published in 2013. The Creaturely Limits of Knowledge, Martin Heidegger's Theological Critique of Immanuel Kant, published in the Weimar Moment, Political Theology, Liberalism, and Law, co-authored with Sam Moyn in 2012. And finally, the ever-interesting topic, Rabban Gamliel, Aphrodite's Bath, and the Question of Pagan Monotheism, published in the Jewish Quarterly Review in spring 2006. His current project is an extended study of the question of what was the fruit that Adam and Eve ate so many years ago. And that's a cultural history of an image and its context over time all across Europe. It'll be a fascinating book. Should be done when?
Oh, that's not nice.
I hope in a year.
Okay.
I think a year
So,
is reasonable.
We can pay attention to that. And his talk today has the compelling title, and clearly the resonance for what we've been hearing for the last 3 weeks on Tuesday evenings with Professor Berlin, Material Culture and Rabbinic Isolation, the Cultural Ecology Perspective. It's a pleasure to welcome Azzan Yadin-Israel.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm coming through loud and clear. All right, so first of all, thank you to the Berg Graduate Center. Thank you to Dean Miller. Thank you to Andrea for inviting me. I say Andrea rather than Professor Berlin because we are friends and colleagues. We both taught at the University of Minnesota many years ago. Just to everyone who helped make this possible and allow me to be part of this very interesting series and raising these very interesting ideas. My comments today are from the perspective of someone who works on textual material, but the question that I'm going to want to explore is the marginalization of material culture in kind of the study of rabbinic sources, or not just rabbinic. I should say rabbinic in late Second Temple, ancient Judaism. Speak louder, yeah. Sorry, since I have the microphone, I wasn't sure, how quietly I should go. But okay. So what I'm going to present to you is part of another book project that I'm working on, unrelated to the forbidden fruit, which is an attempt to take categories that have been developed in the field of contact linguistics and apply them to cultural contact more broadly. So contact linguistics is a branch of linguistics that studies the behavior of languages in a state of contact, when they are in contact with other languages, how the contact with these languages affects each language, how they change, how they adapt, and the like. And what I'm trying to do is glean some of the insights that have been developed by contact linguists and maybe enlarge them in a certain sense so that they can be applied to non-linguistic cultural contact. Obviously, linguistic contact is cultural contact, but I just, more broadly. Here we go. At some point during the reign of Ptolemy VI, somewhere we're talking about in the mid-2nd century BCE, a Jewish high priest named Onias was granted permission to establish a Jewish temple in the Egyptian city of Leontopolis. We don't have any images of I was told I really need to, I realized yesterday I really needed to up my image game. There are no images of this Jewish temple in Leontopolis, but this is a reconstruction of an Egyptian temple in Leontopolis. So that's what I got. That's what I got.
We'll help you out.
There's a dispute whether there have been claims that that temple has been excavated, someone has discovered it, but it's really highly disputed among archaeologists whether that's the case. In any case, the precise year of the temple's founding and which Onias was the founder are a matter of controversy, but it is clear that the temple served the Jewish community of Egypt for about 2.5 centuries. And while there is lively debate about some of the finer details concerning the temple, there is currently scholarly unanimity in struggling to explain what most scholars consider to be the theological scandal of this temple's existence. It is a temple, as they argue, that openly flouts the biblical command that Israel make all their offerings at the temple in Jerusalem. It's stated most clearly in Deuteronomy 12, centralization of the cult, that Jerusalem is the only legitimate temple. How to resolve the contradiction between the supposed exclusivity of the temple in Jerusalem and the historic reality of a temple patronized by the largest and most powerful diaspora Jewish community, that of Egypt. So, for example, a prominent historian of the period, Victor Chirikover, argues that since Egyptian Jewry, quote, revered the traditions of the fathers, it is hard to imagine that Onias found support among the broad sections of the Jews of Egypt when he was about to do something so obviously opposed to Jewish tradition. As a result, Chirikover concludes, the shrine, and this is another quote, possessed purely local significance. So he's minimizing the importance of this temple because it contradicts Jewish tradition. Daniel Schwartz, another contemporary Israeli historian, suggests that Onias' temple cannot be so easily marginalized. The province of Heliopolis figures prominently in the Egyptian Jewish landscape. And so he wonders whether it is, quote, plausible that a temple located in the very heart of this important Jewish population center would be marginal and unimportant. Moreover, had the Jews of Alexandria so fully submitted to the authority of the sanctity of Jerusalem, would they have ignored the Onias temple, whose very existence constitutes a gross violation of Torah law? So Schwartz comes up with another explanation. He can't marginalize it, he thinks, like Chirikover does, but he claims that the silence of Alexandrian Jewry is the result of the development of a kind of spiritualized Jewish view that basically considered temple and temple worship to be secondary and basically marginal. In this way, he's able to maintain explain the presence of the Onias temple, but I want to point out that there is absolutely no evidence for such a group. In other words, this group that he posits, these spiritualized Jews who don't have any interest in the temples, there's no existence of such a group. They've basically been reverse engineered by him from the existence of the non-Jerusalem temple. The difficulty here is that contemporary scholars are addressing a scandal that, based on historical evidence, never occurred. There are no indications of resistance to the Zionist temple from the Jews of Egypt, and also none from the Judean circles, who were doubtless committed to the primacy of the Jerusalem temple. Even the rabbis, even in the Mishnah, which is written much later than the period we're talking about, and redacted in the early 3rd century CE, even there are fairly accommodating statements about the Onias temple. The Mishnah requires, for example, that a vow made to offer burnt offerings in and of itself has to be fulfilled at the Jerusalem temple. But a vow, if someone vows to make a burnt offering at the Onias temple, they should offer it at Jerusalem first and foremost, but if they offer it at the Onias temple, they have fulfilled their vow. So it's a very specific situation, it's a very specific legal scenario, and I should point out that at this point, neither the Jerusalem temple nor the Onias temple are still in existence, so it's theoretical in that regard, but still, they do recognize and admit that in some situations you could fulfill a vow at the Onias temple. My focus in today's presentation is on this outrage quotient disparity between the ancients and the moderns. Why is there so little historical outrage at the existence of the Onias temple, but so much contemporary scholarly outrage? And what can this disparity reveal about the study of ancient Judaism? In seeking to address these questions, I want to draw on insights developed in a different field. As I mentioned, contact linguistics, and more specifically, the study of Creole languages. Now, before introducing the points relevant to the analysis of the Onias temple, I want to say a few words on the introduction of Creolistics, since I recognize that may appear incongruous in a lecture on Ptolemaic Egypt. However, Creolistics is, I find, a very productive field for scholars of ancient Judaism, and in fact of any tradition centered around a canon, because scholars in both fields face a similar issue, namely an abiding tendency to define legitimacy in terms of a single genealogical line of transmission, thereby minimizing the importance of contact with other cultures. I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by that. For scholars of Creoles, the problem is that historical linguistics has formulated a principle called monoparental descent. In other words, descent from a single parent, according to which languages can be traced back through a reconstructed language tree, a Stammbaum, to a single genealogical antecedent. And my next image, there you have it. Thank you. That is a Stammbaum. The idea is, for example, that, as you know, Italian and Spanish and French are daughters of Latin. What that means in practical terms, and here I'm quoting from a very influential book by Sarah Thomason and Terence Kaufman called Language Contact Creolization and Genetic Linguistics. This is the meaning of one of the first principles students learn when they study historical linguistics, namely that a daughter language in a family tree is a changed later form of its single parent language. A language cannot have multiple ancestors in the course of normal transmission. Okay, that's the principle that is in historical linguistics. I'm not advocating for it. I'm just setting this out as the issue. This is, of course, a critical problem for the analysis of Creoles, since Creoles are, by definition, produced in the encounter between two languages, and they have, as a result, been marginalized by traditional linguistic analysis. As Thomason and Kaufman argue, a language not descended from a single linguistic ancestor can no longer be considered to have, quote, a genetic relationship with any antecedent, and therefore is not properly the object of linguistic analysis at all. As new linguistic creations, they do not represent any kind of transmission, broken or unbroken. That's the quote. In response to these issues, a Chicago linguist named Salikoko Mufwene has argued that the position staked out by traditional historical linguistics is rife with problems. For one, its proponents do not offer criteria by which to distinguish non-Creoles from Creoles. In other words, there's no empirical threshold for what constitutes a language that's been disrupted by contact versus a language that has had some other intensive but non-disruptive level of contact. To put this in practical terms, there's no clear criterion for why, for example, Gullah, which is the language of the African American population on the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, why Gullah is considered a Creole, but other languages, other colonial varieties, such as, for example, the English of the Amish or Pennsylvania Dutch, are not considered Creoles. Okay, so there's no clear distinction here. What happens, I'm not going into this in detail, but what ends up happening most of the time is that Creole is used to some extent as a pejorative term. In other words, the Pennsylvania Dutch is Pennsylvania Dutch, but Haitian Creole is kind of marginalized. In linguistic circles, I suspect many times unknowingly, but that's what happens. A second difficulty that Mufwene raises with the whole idea of monoparental descent, the idea of every language descending from only one predecessor, is its willingness to renounce all claims to general validity. In other words, its practitioners recognize the existence of languages that don't fit the model, but rather than rethink the underlying assumptions of historical linguistics, they simply cast this as a failure of those languages. They're improper. They don't have natural transmission, and therefore we don't really need to deal with them, or certainly not deal with them in a serious manner. In light of these difficulties, Mufwene develops a theory of language change that is modeled after population genetics and emphasizes the interaction between the speaker and the broader linguistic ecology. What does that mean? For Mufwene, language acquisition is best understood as a selection process, right? Just as we speak about natural selection, and in population genetics, you'll have the selection of certain features or the suppression of certain features. And just as a living species evolves as the physical environment exerts influence on that species' makeup, so too language is constrained by what Mufwene calls both the external ecology, in other words, the broad sociolinguistic context in which the linguistic exchange occurs. This is roughly analogous to environment, to the broad physical environment in population genetics. And it's also constrained by the internal ecology. In other words, the linguistic traits available to a specific speaker within their immediate linguistic circle. This is almost like their DNA. It's like what they as an individual have linguistically. Language acquisition and language development, then, according to Mufwene, are a recombinatory process. In other words, just like genes change and select different elements, different traits within the gene pool are selected, the same thing happens in linguistic development. A continuous give and take between the linguistic forms to which one is exposed and the external social environment. This approach represents a significant conceptual shift. And here I just say this, I think this is a wonderful, wonderful kind of approach and very important, and I'm completely indebted to Mufwene in terms of what I'm going to be presenting today. This approach represents a significant conceptual shift. First and foremost, it rebuts the logic of monoparental descent. Right? Language acquisition does not consist of one generation transmitting a static system to the next generation. Children do not inherit a system. Rather, they are exposed to a variety of spoken languages, primarily those of family members and peers, but not only. and from which they reconstruct and construct their own individual, their own idiolect, in other words, their own individual speech in a process comparable to gene recombination in biology. Different speakers are also exposed to different combinations of language use and make their individual choices in their own employment of language. Language change then is a constant, it's not an aberration. In other words, it's not something that happens when another language intrudes upon our language, but rather is a constant feature of all living language. It is not the case that static linguistic system suddenly lurches into motion when it comes into contact with another language, but rather an already always changing set of linguistic features is expanded through contact, sometimes dramatically. The most important upshot of Mufena's approach for the analysis of non-linguistic cultural contact is that it collapses the distinction between internal and externally motivated change. Generally, that means that linguists prefer change that occurs internally. In other words, if, let us say, French drops the end consonants of Latin words, that's considered legitimate internal change as part of the kind of development, the monoparental shift that occurs. But if French, for example, starts adopting English words in the 20th century, that's considered intrusion or interference with, because it's externally motivated. It's not, part of the internal development of the language. And this is very intuitive. In other words, this way of thinking is, I think, it's very common, and we think about it in many contexts. Mufena suggests that it's erroneous. That basically, here's a scenario. This is my scenario. Consider three distinctions. Consider the distinction between internal exchange and external change in the following three scenarios. In one, a child born into a non-literate household. A child is born into a non-literate household, but as she grows up and learns to read, she's exposed to an increasingly diverse range of speakers and writers of her language, allowing her to draw from a much richer linguistic feature pool than her peers or family. In another, the growing popularity of texting, especially among teenagers, leads to an increased tendency to abbreviate words through elision. So vacay is vacation, and cray-cray is crazy, and aux for awkward, and so forth. I have teenagers at home. I should just say that right away. I've been studying this linguistic community. The third scenario involves a coastal region that becomes the site of maritime trade with another nation, and features of the trade partner's language, their vocabulary, morphology, what have you, are introduced into the coastal variant of the language. Historical linguistics only classifies the third of these scenarios as external change, the one which includes contact with another language. However, the technological changes that give rise to texting are clearly external to the language. This wasn't the fact that you can only text a certain number of characters is not a linguistic fact, it's a technological one. And in a very significant sense, the individual circumstances of every speaker, in other words, this speaker that developed, learned to read, and so on and so forth, the people they know, the books they read, are also external to the system of the language. So Mufena's approach allows us to discard what I consider to be the analytically misguided division between internal and external change, and grasp linguistic dynamics, and I think cultural dynamics more broadly, as an ecological phenomenon, a constant give and take between the individual members of the species, as it were, the speakers or the performers of the culture, and the broader cultural and linguistic environment. How is all this relevant to ancient Judaism? What I want to argue is that the canon, in other words, the concept of an authoritative canon, plays a very similar role to that played by the linguistic idea of monoparental descent. In other words, it establishes a single constitutive genealogy that marginalizes external contact. What do I mean by that? Second Temple, Rabbinic Judaism, ancient Judaism more broadly, is generally thought of vertically. Its literary oeuvre is cast as a series of responses to the Hebrew Bible. Interpretations, reinterpretations, revisions, expansions, and the like. Jewish communities or individuals that do not easily fit this single vector, reading from the Bible as the Bible down to the rabbis, or however far you want to draw it, are in that sense kind of like Creoles in historical linguistics. They're often marginalized for being the product of an illicit union between two cultures. The most obvious example of this is Hellenistic Judaism, and I'll come back to that in my concluding remarks. Since the genealogical line of transmission from the Bible down to, let's say, the first century Alexandrian philosopher Philo cannot be couched in terms of normal transmission, it's not monoparental descent. You have to introduce Hellenistic thought to it. Philo is often seen as the product of a kind of illicit union between two different parents, between the Bible and Plato, or something along those lines. I'll return to this broader point in my concluding remark. Right now, I want to turn our attention back to the Onias Temple and invoke the work of another Creolist, a French scholar named Robert Chardinson, who specializes in the French Caribbean. Chardinson, in a number of studies, has pointed to a dramatic discrepancy between the historical formation of French Creoles and their later assessment by scholars. In other words, 20th century scholars, or 21st century scholars. That is to say, the majority of the settlers in the French Caribbean came from the northern regions of France, the Languedoc regions, Normandy, Brittany, Ile-de-France, and so forth. And though current knowledge of the linguistic landscape of these regions is deficient, there is no question that there was tremendous dialect differences between the French that was spoken there and the normative French of Paris. Just an example, this is a southern example, but La Fontaine, who traveled through the southwest of France in the second half of the 17th century, wrote that French isn't spoken south of Lyon. In other words, once you go south of Lyon, you can't even understand what these guys are saying. So there's really tremendous difference in the dialects. And yet, many linguists today have used the French of literate 17th century Parisians as the standard against which they judge the deviation, as it were, of French Creoles. So when you study the Creole of Haiti, they're studying against 17th century Paris, when in fact, the French speakers who arrived in Haiti were speaking a completely different dialect. So Chardinson calls this the metropolitan bias. In other words, you're biased towards Paris in this case, and that's what you assume to be the case, and you end up making these terrible analytic errors because you're kind of retrojecting an inappropriate standard onto the earlier historical material. I want to suggest that the outrage quotient disparity that I spoke about earlier, in other words, the gap between how upset contemporary scholars are over the Onias Temple versus the apparent accommodating views of the ancients, is due to a similar metropolitan bias. That is, that contemporary historians judge the religious behavior of the Egyptian Jewish community against the standard of the Jerusalem-centric Judean view that emerged over the course of the Second Temple period. But, as with Chardinson's example, it is unlikely, to my mind, that the Jews who established communities in Egypt following the Babylonian destruction of Judea in 586 BCE ever spoke that religious idiom. To the contrary, a number of sources suggest that the language of the colonists, in other words, the language of these early Jews who are setting out and building Jewish settlements in Egypt, was remarkably different from what we consider to be the normative Jewish religious idiom. The most significant indication that that is the case comes from Jeremiah's rebuke of the Jews of Egypt in the book of Jeremiah in chapter 44. In this passage, the prophet opens with a familiar accusation, telling the Jews of Egypt that they are worshiping other gods, and as a result, the Lord has brought destruction upon you and upon the towns of Judah, and so on and so forth. This is pretty standard. This is basically what prophets do. That's their day job. Tell everyone that they're worshiping the wrong gods, and that's why their life sucks. However, what is remarkable about this passage is that it preserves the response that God receives. In other words, we get to hear the sinning Jews, as it were. The word Jews is a little bit problematic. Jews or Judeans, should really just say Yehudim and leave it at that, and that's the Hebrew term that's used. But and they say the following, and this is I'm starting at verse 15, which is at the very top of the screen. This focuses on the fact that the women are kneading bread as a part of a ritual to a goddess called the Queen of Heaven. Then all the men who were aware that their wives had been making offerings to other gods, and all the women who stood by, a great assembly, all the people who lived in Pathros in the land of Egypt, answered Jeremiah, "As for the word that you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord, we are not going to listen to you. Instead, we will do everything that we have vowed, make offerings to the Queen of Heaven, and pour out libations to her, just as we and our ancestors, our kings and our officials used to do in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. We used to have plenty of food and prospered, and so saw no misfortune. But from the time we stopped making offerings to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out libations to her, we have lacked everything and have perished by the sword and by famine." I'm going to stop there. This is a cogent, even powerful rebuttal. Its first part speaks to the genealogy of Judean polytheism. The gods worshipped in Judea were not, as the prophet claimed, other gods that had not known neither they nor your ancestors. That's in his rebuke that we didn't read. To the contrary, these speakers say, it was normative to worship deities other than the Lord. The Egyptian Yehudim will, they declare, continue their practices just as we and our ancestors, our kings and our officials, used to do in the towns of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. The true cultic genealogy is not, they say, Jeremiah's, but rather the contrary. And it is worth pointing out that these claims are historically cogent. Of Solomon, the founder of the temple, in other words, the king who establishes the temple, we are told, and this is in verse 4, and it says in 1 Kings 11, verse 4, the king, I looked at the wrong, you're just going to have to trust me on this one. I didn't pull that one up. I didn't pull that source up, so no visual. For this one, I'm just going to read it to you. We are told Solomon followed Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites, and Solomon built a high place, in other words, a ritual of Amah, for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. He did the same for all his foreign wives who offered incense and sacrificed to their gods. So, from the foundation of the temple, according to the biblical report, there is a plurality of gods that are being worshipped. And I'm not going to go into a detailed discussion of the history of the temple and the various reforms, Hezekiah and the like, but it suffices for our purposes to point out that in 622 BCE, the Judean king Josiah discovered, I'm putting that in quotation marks, discovered a book in the Jerusalem temple that was then accepted as God's word, and that enjoined Israel to break with their old ways and adopt a new religious approach. Scholars generally associate this with something like the book of Deuteronomy or a version of the book of Deuteronomy. And what's important for the current analysis is that the first act that the king orders, and that's in verse 4, is, quote, the king commanded the high priest Hilkiah, the priest of the second order and the guardians of the threshold, to bring out of the temple of the Lord all of the vessels made for Baal, for Asherah, and for the host of heaven. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron and carried their ashes to Beit El. He deposed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to make offerings in the high places, in the cities of Judah and around Jerusalem, those who had made offerings to Baal, to the sun, to the moon, the constellations, and all the hosts of heaven, and so on and so forth. In other words, at the end of the 7th century, there is still a not only lively, but apparently royally sanctioned worship of gods other than the Lord. I say royally sanctioned because it says he deposed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained. You know, in other words, these high priests they're official high priests. They've been ordained by the kings of Judah, and this is they pay their salary. You know, their salary comes out of the royal coffers. Now, though the Deuteronomist presents these activities as a kind of persistent theological error, the picture that emerges from the biblical description of these moments, the founding of the temple and the Reformation under King Josiah, is of an ongoing worship of gods other than Yahweh, alongside occasional attempts at reform. And this is the context of the Egyptian Jews' response to Jeremiah. We used to offer plenty of food and prospered, but once we stopped, we suffered. And in fact, the first temple stood as a polytheistic institution from roughly 950 or so down to 622, a span of over 300 years. But a single generation after Josiah's death, which, in other words, he dies in 604, and by 586, the temple stands in ruin. So the Jews of Egypt really have a pretty reasonable historic description of the past and why they shouldn't accept Jeremiah's critique. What that means for our analysis is that this gives us a sense of at least the early colonial language, as it were. In the same way that Chaldon-Son is saying that the French speakers were coming from a very different dialect, the Jewish speakers, the Jewish religious practitioners who are founding the communities in Egypt, have a very different set of assumptions about what is normative and what is religiously appropriate than what we see in the book of Deuteronomy and elsewhere. The exchange in Jeremiah 44 indicates just how wide a gap existed between the early Jewish settlers in Egypt and what would become the standard theology of the Judean elites, with its emphasis on Jerusalem as the sole site of legitimate temple worship. The existence of a small Jewish temple in El-Fantini, also in Egypt near modern-day Aswan, offers further support for this view. This temple, which also openly worshipped a female deity named Anat Yahuwah, saying in a footnote, that's another practice that's generally frowned upon in Deuteronomistic circles, stood until the middle of the 4th century BCE, only 200 years prior to the founding of the Onias temple. So you can construct a fairly continuous line of Egyptian theology that does not preclude worship outside of Jerusalem. Here then is the explanation for the outrage quotient disparity. Like the French linguists who mistakenly evaluate creoles against the measure of metropolitan French and Parisian French, contemporary scholars of ancient Judaism, grappling with the Onias temple as a gross violation of Torah law, are adopting a language that was not in fact spoken by the community in question. In other words, these scholars are adopting a Deuteronomistic perspective that involves the centralization of the cult that was not part of the makeup of the community from its very establishment. Overcoming the metropolitan bias, the metropolitan religious bias in this case, allows us to reframe the, as it were, difficult issues of the Jewish temple from Onias and El-Fantini and perhaps elsewhere in ways that will help us recognize the error of assuming that the Deuteronomistic perspective is simply Jewish. In other words, that the Jewish view is unproblematically Deuteronomistic. Of course, the analytic problems brought about by the idea of canon as a kind of monoparental descent run much deeper and are more pervasive than this one historic question. And now I'm going to return to the question, to the illegitimacy of groups that are outside of the monoparental descent, outside of the canonic framework. The concept of Hellenistic Judaism is itself an expression of an ideology based on monoparental descent. In other words, the phrase Hellenistic Judaism. The analytic work performed by this phrase is clear. It distinguishes between Hellenistic Judaism and some sort of unmarked, normative, plain old Judaism. The latter representing the religious and national sensibilities of Hebrew and Aramaic speaking Jews of the same period. However, these Hebrew and Aramaic speaking Jews had been living in a cultural contact environment since the end of the 4th century BCE. Actually, I shouldn't even say that. It's actually much longer than that. There's Hellenistic presence way before the Alexander's conquest, but at least under a political and intensive state of cultural contact with Hellenistic culture from the 4th century BCE. First under Hellenistic rule, which includes, of course, the Maccabees, and then as part of a culturally Hellenized Roman East. In what possible sense, then, can these Jews be considered not Hellenistic? In practice, the concept of Hellenistic Judaism does not demarcate the Jews affected by Hellenism from those unaffected by it. Rather, it identifies a marked region, in other words, Hellenistic Judaism, whose study must recognize a broader non-Jewish cultural context, thereby allowing for the existence of a corresponding unmarked region, that of just Judaism, where cultural context can be conveniently ignored. It is the idea of monoparental descent, in this sense, as a type of understanding of what the canon is, with its vertical diachronic view of cultural change, that makes normative the study of rabbinic sources in isolation from their broader non-rabbinic and non-Jewish context. Since the canon in question is literary, another effect of this dominant paradigm in its application to ancient Jewish sources is that it also isolates the rabbis from the surrounding material culture, and in that way as well impoverishes our understanding of ancient Judaism. Thank you.
The floor is now open for questions. We have some more refreshments.
All right. Should I just, yeah.
So might the temple in Alexandria have been one of those attempts at reform to have the Jews worship the biblical God as opposed to these foreign deities?
So the temple, first of all, the temple's not in Alexandria, it's in Temple Leontopolis, but no, the idea of worshiping only one God and perhaps believing in only one God is closely tied with an ideology that the worship of that God takes place in Jerusalem. So whatever the precise nature of the worship in the Onias temple, the temple in the Egyptian town of Leontopolis, it was standing in contrast or in opposition to the regnant or the dominant theology that has worship of one God and worship of God in Jerusalem. Those are they come together. So these weren't attempts at reform. These were very problematic views in that context, and that's how they're viewed by these contemporary scholars who are trying to, maneuver around what they consider to be the scandal, but that no one in the ancient world seems to consider all that scandalous.
So, Azzan, if I could just jump in, playing the role of the curmudgeon for change. The title of your talk had material culture. So, can you bring the linguistic argument around to talk about the problem of material culture in the understanding of ancient Judaism?
So maybe I didn't do that very fully at the end. I alluded to that at the end. But so the problem of material culture becomes inextricably linked with the problem of the canon. That is to say, if you understand ancient Judaism in a vertical, as a vertical entity, that is to say that you understand it going from the Bible, late biblical sources, down to the rabbis, and each kind of generation is passing itself down to the next one, and so that allows you to isolate your subject matter from external change, from language contact, from cultural contact. That's not to say, of course, people know that there were other communities in the area and so forth, but those can be framed as foreign interventions, as a kind of interference, as inherently illegitimate, and so forth. Now, because this model is based on a textual canon, in other words, because the canon in question is the Bible, and you're trying to define all of these later Jewish traditions in their relation to the Bible as biblical interpreters, expanders of the biblical text, how do they relate to the biblical laws, how do they interpret biblical laws, and so on and so forth, material culture is inherently excluded.
Yeah, except half of the book of Exodus and all of Leviticus is entirely material culture. So why make the assumption, see, you're bracketing out the contents of the text and saying that the tradition is textual and that's the monoparental approach, and therefore everything that comes from outside is excluded and everything that's outside is not textual. But the texts are themselves about things. Yeah. So why does that never fit into the story? Because a text about material things is a text. In other words, if a text says, in other words, let's take ekphrasis, okay? So ekphrasis is a poetic form in which the poet writes about a piece of art. So the fact that in ekphrasis, the poet is writing about, say, a statue or a picture or something like that, it's still a poem. There's still a literary entity. So I'm not sure what you refer to when you say that the book of Exodus is material culture, but certainly the book of Exodus is a text that includes references to material culture. I mean, obviously things like the temple, the tabernacle, and so forth. Right. But it is in and of itself a text, and it was understood as a text by but the people that I'm most concerned about, the people that I'm talking about here, are the scholars who are forming our understanding of ancient Judaism. In other words, they don't understand the book of Exodus as having anything to do with material culture. They understand it as a text, and the question is, how do the rabbis interpret it? How does the Qumran community interpret it? And if someone diverges from it, why would they do so? But here's the thing, the temple building in Egypt that you're talking about is precisely reflecting a felt sense that the materiality of the practice is crucial. Right. So in a way, your story about this is much more complicated. But the fact that back then it was non-controversial suggests that there was a much greater openness to material culture. That is, I completely agree with you. In other words, you're basically rephrasing what I called this outrage disparity, the outrage quotient disparity. Right, in Egypt, they were not beholden to this ideology. In other words, the Egyptian, kind of the whole point of talking about what the language of the colonists was to say that the Egyptian Jews at that time, in their historical context, were not beholden to this kind of textual ideology, did not see themselves as having to abide by the laws of Deuteronomy and having to commit to this model. What's interesting is that contemporary scholars find that outrageous. In other words, contemporary scholars are importing this exclusionary understanding, an understanding that says it all has to come from Deuteronomy, it all has to be defined in these certain ways. So that's exactly right. The ancient sources are not outraged by this. They know that there are communities that are from the get-go non-Deuteronomistic, right? So they have a temple in Heliopolis or in Leontopolis. They have a temple in Elephantine. They have
a pretty continuous presence. They have these statements that we saw from the book of Jeremiah of the early Jewish settlers saying, no, we need to continue worshiping other gods and goddesses. We need to maintain this, and so on and so forth. And it's only later when this ideology kind of congeals and becomes dominant that this becomes so problematic. And you have contemporary scholars saying, oh, this must have been marginal, because otherwise, how can we countenance such a gross violation of Torah law? Even though for hundreds of years people are worshiping there, So the idea is that the marginalization of outside contact is also understood by contemporary scholars, not by the ancients, as a marginalization of material culture. That the understanding is so textual,
Right.
so canonic.
It's signal and noise.
It's what?
Signal and
Right,
noise.
so the outside is the noise, right. So it's so dominated by this Deuteronomic view and these Deuteronomic ideologies that the contemporary scholars are missing, like the French colonists, they're failing to understand what was historically going on there, because they cannot but retroject their own understanding, which is textual and exclusionary, onto the earlier historic period, which wasn't textual and exclusionary.
I have more to say, but Alex.
I just wanted to add that this is a wonderful way to think about Second Temple Judaism. I just want to add one point I think would be helpful to this. And this is from my own area of Dead Sea Scrolls research, is that for years and years, people assumed that this group of sectarians out in the desert had kind of shunned the temple life in Jerusalem, and they had lived a life of prayer or community,
Right.
temple in exile. And this is kind of contrary to some earlier perspectives, kind of early days of research, that they had an altar at their site of Qumran, and they were offering sacrifices. And this was something that the first excavator of the site, Roland DeVoe, argued. And then even Solomon Schechter, this is the irony, Schechter, who had available 100 years ago a text from the Dead Sea Scrolls community, made the case that there must have been an altar wherever these people lived, outside of Jerusalem.
Just based on the Damascus.
Yes, based on a text only that has ample references to sacrifices. Now this is all important because once the Dead Sea Scrolls began to be deciphered from the 50s onward, everybody said this is impossible because of exactly the argument that you made. Now, in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, Jody Magnus has made a strong case for pushing back against this
The exclusion of
exclusionary principle. That
yeah.
she says, look, the archaeological evidence is ambiguous at best, but all of the other kind of comparative data from the Mediterranean sites, similar sites, point to sacrifices going on. And if you stop for a second and stop kind of being so convinced that this is not something they would do, right, and maybe think about Schechter's kind of beginner's mind approach to this. He read this text and he thought they were offering sacrifices. So this is a good example of where we kind of can bracket off these whatever you want to call them, metropolitan bias.
Sure. Right.
And I think she's right.
Yeah.
And again, it's interesting that there hasn't been this kind of, not everybody's jumping on the bandwagon because of the very reasons that you described among modern scholars.
Alex, have people so I know that Jody hit headwinds immediately when she proposed this. What's in
this is what's interesting.
Your scholarly community? What's happening now?
She gave a talk a few years ago at the Society of Biblical Literature, which is the kind of major academic setting for this, mostly based on text scholars, by the way. And part of it is kind of the dynamism of how she presented it. Everybody was all excited about it. And then she published an article on it in the Journal of Ancient Judaism from a couple of years ago. I'm one of the co-authors. We had a whole theme issue on this topic. And everybody kind of engaged with her, talking about the idea of, what would the text say. But in some ways, it was her article stood outside of that entire discourse because they were still kind of circling around. Right. Do you have sacred meals?
Standard, yeah.
What would the kind of standard text say about non-Jerusalem focused worship? But there was nothing like what you're doing here, which was what would it mean to talk about kind of the genealogy of non-Jerusalem based worship, which is what she did for the other Mediterranean sites, non-Jewish in particular. The challenge is that you need to do that for the Jewish sites as well, and this is kind of where it fits into the broader genealogy that you described, or maybe just all over the place. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. That's
great.
Great. Yeah. Really interesting.
I came in when you were in the middle of the historical linguistic part, and sorry I missed the first 10 minutes, that was all very interesting, and parenthetically, I've always wondered why English, with its two parents, isn't classified as a Creole. But leaving aside the evident invalidity of a theory that fails to account for the observable phenomena that it purports to explain, isn't it inherently problematic to use a genetic model for language change anyway, inasmuch as language is a primarily cultural phenomenon, not a primarily biological one? And so much the more so when you then take that genetic or genealogical model and apply it to culture. I mean, at best it can serve us as useful metaphors, but hardly a template for describing what actually happens.
Why is it hardly a template?
Because it's not genetic. That is to say,
that's why it's a template. Not the claim isn't that there's actually genetic.
Yeah, so to speak of, that's why I'm saying that to speak of parents of languages is at best a metaphor, and to speak of selection through adaptation or something like that, likewise, is a metaphor.
Yes.
What's actually happening is that people learn stuff, and they do stuff, and they interact, but this is not inheritance. This is
So I think there are a couple of things here, and I think we might be confusing two different. So the idea of the parent language, that belongs to the field of historical linguistics, which is the field that's being critiqued. In other words, the idea that the monoparental descent and so on and so forth, that's the idea of the Latin being the mother of French and of Spanish. I'll just say Romanian, because no one ever says Romanian. Everyone always talks about it. But, so that's one kind of family metaphor. I mean, what's particularly odd about this as a metaphor is that what's particularly odd about this as a metaphor is that it draws on the imagery of biological reproduction, and yet claims that there can only be one parent. In other words, even on the most basic level, historical linguistics has a very weird metaphor that it's using. The issue of gene recombination or recombinatory selection, however, is from this kind of ecological approach that's been developed by Sally Coco-Mufwene. But I'm not exactly sure what the issue is with using insights from the field of population genetics to say this is similar to how language change or language acquisition occurs. Obviously it's not actually the same thing. Obviously this is an analytic framework that can help illuminate certain things.
Ava, you missed the beginning, where Azzan laid out very carefully that this was just a modular approach.
Except for the word "just," I agree. No, I mean that. I mean the analytic models are significant.
Yes, agreed.
I mean, I will say this is not something I want to go into, but the idea of historical linguistics has a very dark background. In other words, the idea of kind of languages being passed through one lineage ends up emerging in the same circles that ideas of racial purity are being developed. So that it's kind of like you kind of have these two trajectories where the nation and the language of the nation are both understood to be uncontaminated by outsiders in some way. Now, obviously, that has nothing to do with people who are historical linguists. They're not. No one's adopting that view, but it does suggest that there are very significant ramifications for how these things, at least, were thought of early on in their development, and that there are today important analytic differences between different models. So, I think the ecological model is better. It's more coherent and it avoids many of the problems, particularly with regard to language contact, that historic or genetic linguistics has.
So we're at our hour, and in deference to those who have to teach or participate in class, we need to stop our formal presentation here. And before we thank Azzan for what he's given us, just to say that it's possible to linger informally, that's fine, but we do have to stop now formally. So thank you very much.